The air in the conference room was cold, thick with the smell of money and ambition. On stage, my husband Marcus was basking in the applause of investors, a picture of success. He was so confident up there, selling my dream as his own. He never saw me. Not really. Not until my hand went up. "Mr. Reed," I said, my voice steady as every eye in the room turned to me, the quiet wife in the back row. "Your entire presentation for the Haven is based on the designs of the architect known as Tara. Could you please tell the investors if you have secured the exclusive, legally binding intellectual property rights from her for this project?" He froze, that perfect smile faltering. The color drained from his face as he stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time in years. I didn't wait for an answer he didn't have. "Because I am Tara," I said, my voice ringing with clarity. "And you don't." I clicked a button on my tablet, and the main screen behind him split in two. On one side, his presentation with its beautiful, fatally flawed designs. On the other, my real, copyrighted blueprints. "What you have," I told the silent room, "is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit waiting to happen. What I have is the real thing." The look on my husband's face in that moment wasn't just shock. It was the look of a man watching a 20-year foundation turn to dust. But that explosion was just the final crack in a structure that had been crumbling for years, right under my feet. But that explosion was just the final crack in a structure that had been crumbling for years, right under my feet. And the first hairline fracture, the one that splintered everything, appeared on a quiet Tuesday night. The kind of night that's supposed to be safe, when the only sounds are the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle rustle of the oak leaves outside the window. My home office was my sanctuary. It still smelled faintly of graphite and paper, a scent that had comforted me since I was a little girl. In the center of the room sat the only thing I'd brought with me from my childhood home, a massive oak drafting table. My father, a civil engineer who believed in the integrity of a well-drawn line, had given it to me for my 16th birthday. Its surface was a roadmap of my life, covered in nicks from slipped X-Acto knives, faint coffee cup rings from 1,000 all-nighters, and the ghosts of blueprints past. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was my partner, the silent keeper of my soul's work. Marcus had always called it that old thing, pushing for me to replace it with something sleek and glass from a sterile European catalog. I never could. On that table, I wasn't just a wife or a supporter. I was an artist, a creator. I was Tara. That night I was lost in the world of the Haven. It was my magnum opus, the culmination of everything I believed about design. It wasn't just another soulless suburban development of cookie-cutter houses. It was a community woven into the landscape, with bioswales for natural drainage, homes oriented for passive solar, and a central greenway that connected every resident to nature. It was smart, it was sustainable, and it was beautiful. It was a legacy. As my pencil moved across the vellum, tracing the curve of a walking path, I felt that familiar sense of peace, of rightness. This was what I was born to do. That's when I heard his voice drift down the hall. Marcus was on the phone. Usually, his late-night calls were just white noise, a low murmur of business speak I had long ago learned to tune out. But this time was different. There was a coiled excitement in his tone, a conspiratorial edge that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He was talking to his brother Leo. I paused, my pencil hovering over the page. "No, the site survey is done," Marcus was saying, and I could hear the clink of ice in his whiskey glass. "The big thing now is the schematics. Leo, the Haven schematics are almost done." My schematics. My heart gave a little trip. He so rarely took an interest in the fine details of my work, usually just waiting for the finished product he could present as his own vision. He laughed, a low, smug sound that slid under my office door like a snake. "It's Tara's best work yet. Absolutely groundbreaking." Tara. The name hit me like a physical blow. It was my professional pseudonym, the name I used to submit designs to competitions and journals, the name that had built a quiet, formidable reputation in the architectural world. It was a secret we had created together years ago. "It protects us," he'd said. "It lets you be the pure artist, and I can be the face. No one will poach you. Your genius stays with the company. Our company." It had sounded like a shield then. Now, hearing him use it, it sounded like a brand he owned. I put my pencil down, my hand suddenly unsteady. The beautiful lines on the page seemed to blur. I strained to hear, my whole body tense. "Once I have the final files, we're golden. Marcus continued, his voice dropping lower. "The investors are already lining up based on the concept art alone. We just have to make the move at the right time. Be patient." A knot of pure ice was forming in my gut. What move? What final files? I was the one creating them. Then came the words that fractured my world. Leo must have asked if I was on board, or if I knew what was happening. I heard Marcus chuckle again, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Evelyn?" he said, the way one might talk about a piece of predictable, slow-moving machinery. "Oh, don't you worry about her. She'll never see it coming." "Oh?" "She'll never see it coming." The pencil slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent house. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the plans for a perfect community, a place of harmony and connection, and all I could feel was the gut-wrenching violence of his betrayal. He wasn't talking about a business partner. He was talking about a mark, a target. My mind started racing, frantically connecting dots that I hadn't even realized were there. His sudden questions about my cloud backup passwords, which he disguised as concern over cybersecurity. His encouragement for me to compile all the project files into one master folder for organizational streamlining. His casual suggestion just last week that I should really take a solo vacation after this project wrapped up, that I'd earned a break. Each memory was a small, polite betrayal, a little lie paving the way for the one big, life-shattering one. I looked down at my hands, resting on the scarred wood of my father's table. This table had seen me through college finals, through the terrifying first years of our business when we were one bad deal away from bankruptcy. It had been my anchor when I designed the community that won Marcus his first award, the one that put us on the map. He had accepted that award with a speech about his unshakable vision and his tireless work ethic. He had forgotten to thank me then, too. I had told myself it was an oversight, a simple mistake, but it wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I wasn't his partner. I was his ghostwriter, his secret weapon, his most valuable and most invisible asset. And now, my greatest work, the project I'd poured my very soul into, was just another asset to be liquidated in the hostile takeover of my own life. The shock began to recede, and something else flowed into the void. It wasn't hot, fiery rage. It was a cold, quiet clarity that was almost terrifying in its intensity. The woman hunched over the drafting table, the quiet creator who just wanted to build beautiful things, was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone who understood that you can't build on a crumbling foundation. Sometimes, you have to tear the whole rotten structure down to the studs and start again. And I finally had the real blueprints. Having the blueprints to a man's betrayal is one thing. The next is to find the load-bearing walls, the weak points in his plan. To do that, I had to stop being his wife and start being a surveyor of my own ruined life. I had to watch, and I had to listen. Most of all, I had to pretend that everything was fine, even as the floorboards were groaning beneath my feet. The next few days were a masterclass in performance. I smiled at breakfast. I asked about his day. I played the part of Evelyn Reed, devoted wife, a role I had perfected over 20 years. He didn't notice a thing. Why would he? He hadn't truly looked at me in at least a decade. To him, I was part of the landscape, as predictable and constant as the Texas Sunday. This blissful ignorance was the first tool I sharpened. Our 20th anniversary arrived on a Saturday, dawning bright and painfully clear. 20 years, 2 decades. In American marriages, that's an institution. You get the nice china. You get a party. You get a gift that's supposed to symbolize a lifetime of shared memories and devotion. In the early years, when we were still building something together instead of just living in it, Marcus had been a wonderful gift giver. One year, for my birthday, he'd spent a month tracking down a rare, out-of-print book on Japanese garden design I'd mentioned once in passing. That book was still on the shelf in my office, its spine soft and worn. It was a reminder of a man who used to listen. This year, a large, sleek box sat on the kitchen island, wrapped in expensive, impersonal silver paper. "Happy anniversary, Ev," he said, kissing the air beside my cheek. He smelled of expensive cologne and the faint, anxious scent of a man trying too hard. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "Go on, open it." I pulled at the ribbon. Inside was not jewelry, not a trip, not a first edition book. It was a collection of white plastic hubs, sensors, and a large glass-faced tablet, a smart home system. The whole 9 yards. "It's the best on the market," he announced proudly, already pulling pieces out of the box. "I've been wanting to do this for years. Everything will be connected. The lights, the security cameras, the thermostat, even the blinds. Total efficiency. You can control the entire house right from this tablet or your phone." I'm straight. He spent the next hour like a kid on Christmas morning, installing the main hub in the living room, replacing light switches, and mounting a new high-definition camera that pointed at our front door. He wasn't giving me a gift. He was upgrading his property. I was just the primary user. I smiled and nodded and told him it was amazing. "What a surprise, Marcus. So practical." My voice sounded hollow in my own ears, but he didn't notice. He was too busy syncing the system to his phone, his face lit by the cool blue glow of the screen. "Look at this," he said, tapping his phone. The lights in the kitchen dimmed and brightened on his command. The future, right here. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Our home, my sanctuary, was now a network he could monitor and control from anywhere in the world. He was giving himself a new set of eyes, a new level of control, all under the guise of an anniversary present. The thoughtlessness of it was breathtaking. It was a gift that said, "I have optimized your environment. Now continue to operate within it." Later that afternoon, he left for a quick round of golf with his brother. I knew it was a lie. The silence he left behind was heavy, humming with the low electronic pulse of our newly intelligent house. I escaped to my office, to the one room he'd shown no interest in upgrading. I ran my hand over the familiar scarred surface of my oak drafting table. The wood was warm and solid beneath my palm. It felt real, honest. It was a surface that demanded work and creativity, not just a password. I thought of that little book on Japanese gardens and felt a pang of grief so sharp it almost took my breath away. I wasn't mourning the lack of a romantic gift. I was mourning the man who would have known to give it. He returned in the evening, and we went to dinner at an expensive steakhouse where the conversation was as dry as the aged beef. He talked about the market, about interest rates, about a new zoning variance. I nodded and made the appropriate noises, a perfect echo of the woman I used to be. My real thoughts were miles away, back in my office, calculating angles he couldn't see, designing a structure he would never comprehend. The next day, I approached the new tablet mounted on the kitchen wall. It glowed with an eerie readiness. I told myself I needed to learn how to use it, to adjust the lighting schedule or check the air quality. It was a lie, of course. I was looking for something. With a few taps, I opened the calendar application. It was synced to his account, just as he'd proudly told me. It was filled with his life. Board meeting, lunch with investors, golf with Leo. And then I saw it, next Tuesday, 2 p.m., an entry that made my blood run cold. Haven launch strategy session final. My breath hitched. My fingers, trembling slightly, tapped on the event. The details opened in a new window. Location, a conference room at a downtown law firm. And below that, the attendee list. Marcus Reed, Leo Reed. And a third name, a name I had never heard before, K. Vance. I stared at that name until the letters blurred, K. Vance. The betrayal was no longer a faceless, formless suspicion I'd overheard in a darkened hallway. It was real. It had a name. It had a final meeting scheduled. The impersonal, soulless gift, the monument to his disconnect, had just become my most valuable tool. He thought he was putting me in a cage of his own design. He had no idea he'd just handed me the key. My hunt had a new direction. I wasn't just looking for proof anymore. I was looking for K. Vance. I wasn't just looking for proof anymore. I was looking for K. Vance. A name on a screen is an abstraction, a ghost in the machine. To fight a ghost, you have to make it real. You have to give it a face. My first step was to move toward the one person I knew was a part of this, the co-signer on my husband's betrayal, his brother Leo. The perfect opportunity came that weekend, disguised as a mandatory family fun day. Leo and his wife hosted a backyard barbecue every year, a sprawling, chaotic affair that was a pillar of our suburban Texas social calendar. In the past, I'd found them exhausting, the forced smiles, the repetitive small talk, the sheer noise of it all. This year, I saw it for what it was, a hunting ground. I put on a simple linen dress, a friendly, non-threatening smile, and I went to hunt. The air in their backyard was thick and heavy with the trinity of Texas summer, freshly cut grass, chlorine, and the smoky, sweet smell of brisket cooking low and slow in a massive, stainless steel smoker. Kids shrieked as they cannonballed into the pool. Their parents gathered around Yeti coolers full of craft beer and White Claw, talking about property taxes and the high school football team. It was a perfect picture of American suburban bliss, a Norman Rockwell painting come to life, and it all felt like a beautiful, elaborate lie. I moved through the party like I always did, a ghost in my own life. I refilled chip bowls, complimented a neighbor on her new haircut, and listened to Leo's wife talk for 10 minutes about the nightmare of getting their son into the right summer camp. I was playing the part of Evelyn, the quiet, agreeable wife. Invisible. It was the best camouflage I could have asked for. I was standing by the drink table, swirling the condensation on a plastic cup of iced tea, when Leo made his move. He came up beside me, a little too close, and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was meant to be a gesture of familiar affection, but it felt proprietary, condescending. "Ev, there you are," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Leo had always been a softer, paler version of his brother, with the same ambition but none of the charisma to pull it off. He was a follower, a pilot fish clinging to the shark. "Can I steal you for a second?" He guided me away from the noise, toward a quiet corner of the yard where his wife's prize-winning rose bushes were aggressively blooming. The sweet, cloying scent of the flowers was almost suffocating. "Just wanted to see how you were holding up," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of practiced sincerity. "Marcus has been, well, he's under a lot of pressure." I took a slow sip of my tea. I said nothing. I just looked at him, my expression one of mild, wifely concern. An empty stage for him to perform on. "This Haven project, it's his whole legacy on the line, he continued, filling the silence I'd offered him. "The Q4 projections are astronomical. It's a pressure cooker, and he's feeling every bit of it." My internal translator was working overtime. Pressure meant he was getting nervous. Legacy meant he was trying to steal mine. He wasn't worried about his brother, he was doing damage control. He was testing the waters, checking to see if the victim suspected anything. I just nodded slowly. "He's been working so hard," I said, my voice soft. It was the line he expected, the response I'd been programmed to give for 20 years. This seemed to encourage him. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even more. "Exactly. And look, between us, he's had to make some tough calls. He's had to bring in some new, aggressive talent to get this thing over the line." The word hung in the air between us. Aggressive. It was a word meant to conjure a world of sharp elbows and ruthless deals, a world that a quiet woman who liked to draw gardens couldn't possibly understand. He was preemptively framing me as someone who was out of her depth, someone who just wouldn't get it. I let my eyes drift toward the chaos of the party. I could feel him watching me, waiting for a reaction, for tears, for questions, for some sign of weakness. I gave him nothing. I just waited. He finally broke, just as I knew he would. "There's this brilliant young consultant he's brought on," he said, trying to sound casual. "Kendra. A real shark, fresh out of business school, full of all these newfangled ideas. Honestly, she's exactly what the project needed to find that next gear." "Kendra. Qu'avance." The world didn't tilt. No lightning struck. There was just a quiet, cold click in the back of my mind, the sound of a final puzzle piece sliding into its rightful place. It was the most violent, clarifying moment of my life, and my expression never changed. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of something other than grief. It was contempt. He was so sure of his own cleverness, so certain of my ignorance. I gave him a small, placid smile. "Well, it's good he has the help he needs," I said calmly. "Anything for the project to succeed." The response threw him. It wasn't what he'd expected. He'd come to plant a seed of doubt, to gently prepare me for the idea of a new, important woman in my husband's professional life. He expected me to be threatened or worried. My calm acceptance left him with nowhere to go. He just nodded, patting my shoulder again. "Exactly, Ev, you always get it." I excused myself, saying I needed to check on the dessert table. I walked away, feeling his confused eyes on my back. He thought he'd handled me. He had no idea he'd just armed me. I stood by the edge of the pool, watching the distorted, wavering reflections of laughing families in the bright blue water. Everything looked bent, unreal. But for me, the world had just snapped into sharp, brutal focus. The ghost had a name. Kendra. The next step was simple. I had to see this brilliant young shark for myself. The surveyor's work was done. It was time for the architect to start drawing a new plan. The surveyor's work was done. It was time for the architect to start drawing a new plan. But before I could draw my own, I had to see theirs. I had to get my hands on the blueprints of their betrayal, to understand the full scope of the demolition they had planned for my life. The opportunity came 3 days later. Marcus announced he was going on a 2-day site visit up in Dallas. He packed a small overnight bag, kissed me with the practiced distraction of a man whose mind was already 1,000 miles away, and left. I knew exactly which site he was visiting, and her name was Kendra. The silence in the house after his car pulled away was different this time. It wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. It was mine. I waited until well after midnight. I watched the last of the lights in the neighborhood houses blink out, until the whole street was wrapped in a blanket of suburban quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the sprinklers on the lawn next door. I made a pot of coffee, the dark, bitter smell filling the kitchen, and I walked down the hall to his study. Entering his office always felt like crossing into a foreign country. Where my office was a creative chaos of paper, books, and living plants, his was a sterile monument to success. A massive glass and chrome desk dominated the room, flanked by 2 black leather chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in. The walls were a gallery of his ego, framed magazine covers featuring his face, photos of him shaking hands with the governor, his Developer of the Year award gleaming under a spotlight. There wasn't a single personal photo, not one of me or of us. It was the office of a man who was in love with an idea of himself. I sat in his chair. It was cold against my skin. The air hummed with the silent, expensive power of his custom-built computer. I tapped the space bar, and the monitor flickered to life, illuminating my face in the darkness. A single box glowed in the center of the screen. Password. My heart started to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. This was the real border crossing. I typed in our anniversary date. Access denied. I tried his birthday. Access denied. I tried the name of his first show dog, the one that had won him a blue ribbon when he was 12, a story he told at every dinner party. Access denied. Incorrect password. Try again. Each rejection was a small digital slap in the face. He had built a fortress around his life, and I didn't even have the key to the front gate. I leaned back in the cold leather chair, the glow of the screen mocking me. I felt a surge of despair, a feeling that I was already too late, that he had locked me out so completely I would never find my way in. Then I closed my eyes and thought of Leo at the barbecue, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I thought of the words he had used, the narrative he was trying to build. And one word echoed in my mind, the word Marcus used to describe everything he touched, everything he wanted: legacy. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I typed Marcus Reed Legacy. Access denied. I tried the Reed Legacy. Access denied. My frustration was mounting. I thought about his ego, his relentless focus on the future he was building, the one without me. He'd even scheduled the final meeting in the year 2025. A new thought sparked. I typed in a new password. My Legacy. 2025. The screen flickered, and then his desktop bloomed into view. I was in. A wave of something cold and triumphant washed over me. The violation felt righteous. His desktop was as sterile as his office. Neatly organized folders, a generic corporate wallpaper. I started to search, my hands moving quickly, efficiently. I looked for folders with names like Haven, Kendra, Vance. I found a folder named Q4 Projections, buried inside another folder named Archived. It was an old trick of his, hiding things in plain sight. I clicked on it. A second password box appeared. My heart sank, but then I saw the password hint, founder. A bitter laugh almost escaped my lips. I typed Marcus Reed. Incorrect. I typed Leo Reed. Incorrect. On a wild, desperate hunch, my fingers typed the 5 letters of my secret name, the name of the true founder of everything in this room. Tara. The folder opened. Inside were 2 files that would change everything. The first was a PowerPoint presentation. Vance. Reed Developments. A New Horizon. I clicked it open. Slide after slide of my work, my concepts, my passion, all repackaged under a sleek new logo. I saw my designs for the Haven, my unique bioswales, my signature greenway paths. And on the slide titled The Team, there was a picture of Marcus, smiling and confident, and next to him, a picture of a sharp, ambitious-looking young woman with blonde hair. Kendra Vance, Chief Strategy Officer. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the second file. It was a PDF from a top-tier law firm, the kind that charges $1,000 an hour to make problems disappear. The title was Memorandum on Asset Division in a No-Fault Divorce. I scrolled through pages of dense legalese, my eyes scanning for the relevant sections. I found the part about shared assets, about the company we had built together. My eyes landed on a sentence in a paragraph outlining their strategy for minimizing my claim. It was a strategy built on the legal argument that since I held no official title, drew no formal salary, and worked from a home office, my role could be defined as that of a non-contributing spouse. Non-contributing. The two words hung there on the screen, glowing in the dark. They sucked the air from my lungs. 20 years of my life. 20 years of late nights hunched over my drafting table, of turning his vague, half-formed ideas into award-winning communities. 20 years of sacrificing my own name and recognition to build his. All of it, my entire adult life, reduced to two dismissive, clinical words. I was not a partner. I was a zero. I didn't cry. The pain was too sharp, too precise for tears. It was a piece of ice in my chest, a cold, hard rage that solidified into something unbreakable. I methodically plugged in a small flash drive, one I'd hidden in my desk drawer for months, and copied everything, every file, every slide, every word. I shut down the computer, leaving no trace. I walked out of his sterile, empty office and closed the door without a sound. Back in my own office, I sat down at my old oak drafting table. The wood, scarred with the history of my actual contributions, felt like the only real thing in the world. The architect had seen the enemy's blueprints. They were cheap, they were flawed, and they were built on a foundation of lies. And I finally knew exactly where to place the dynamite. The architect had seen the enemy's blueprints. They were cheap, they were flawed, and they were built on a foundation of lies. And I knew exactly where to place the dynamite. The first step, however, wasn't demolition. It was construction. To bring down their house of cards, I first had to build them a beautiful, irresistible trap. That night, after Marcus returned from his trip, full of false apologies for being too busy to call, I waited for the house to fall silent. At 2 a.m, I walked into my office. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a workshop, a laboratory. My old oak drafting table wasn't a partner in creation anymore. It was a war table. I brewed a pot of coffee so strong it felt like a declaration of intent, and I got to work. My mission was to create a second, secret set of blueprints for the Haven, a set so close to the original that only a true expert would spot the differences, but so deeply flawed that building from them would lead to catastrophic failure. It was the most intricate, malicious piece of design work I had ever done. I felt a grim, exhilarating sense of focus. This was my art, weaponized. I started with the digital files, creating a perfect duplicate of my masterwork. Then, piece by piece, I began to poison it. I started with the water. On the topographical survey maps, I altered the grading for the main residential sector by less than 0.5%. It was a tiny, elegant lie on a page, a change so subtle no investor or business school shark would ever notice. But I knew what that 0.5% meant. I knew that during the first big Texas thunderstorm, the storm drains would be overwhelmed. Water would pool against the foundations of 24 homes, creeping into crawl spaces, turning a dream home into a mold-infested money pit. It was a multi-million-dollar mistake, hidden in a single graceful line. Next, I went after the Sunday. The core of the Haven's eco-friendly promise was my passive solar design. I carefully rotated the orientation of the primary housing clusters by a mere 7 degrees to the west. On the blueprints, the change was almost invisible. In reality, it would render the entire system useless. The beautiful floor-to-ceiling windows designed to capture the winter sun would instead bake the houses in the brutal afternoon heat of July and August, sending air conditioning bills into the stratosphere. The project's green credentials would be a joke. Finally, I went into the specifications, the DNA of the project. In the 100-page document that listed every single material to be used, from nails to support beams, I made my most surgical changes. I swapped out the specified sustainably harvested bamboo flooring for a cheaper, almost identical-looking laminate that I knew would warp in the Texas humidity. I recalibrated the load-bearing calculations for the community center's magnificent green roof, reducing its structural support by a factor that was just on the edge of acceptable until the day it wasn't. Each alteration was a quiet, ticking time bomb, signed with the invisible ink of my expertise. As I worked, the phrase from the legal memo echoed in my head, non-contributing spouse. With every flawed calculation, with every stroke of my digital pen, I whispered it to myself. This is for the non-contributing spouse, I thought as I doomed the foundations. This is for the woman with no official title, I murmured as I sabotaged the solar grid. It was a cold, righteous fury that fueled me, the fury of a creator watching her work being stolen, her existence erased. I was using the very skills they had devalued and dismissed to weave the net that would destroy them. After 2 nights of meticulous, painstaking work, the Trojan horse was complete. Now I just had to get it inside the gates. I couldn't just hand it to him. The gift had to be his own discovery. I renamed the folder of poisoned blueprints Haven Master Draft V2 and placed it on a shared network drive we'd set up years ago for family photos, a digital space he hadn't thought about in years. Then, I set the bait. I used an anonymous email service to send a message to his work address. The subject line was project files, and the only thing in the body was a single, corrupted zip file. I knew his company's IT security was strict. They would flag the email, and their standard protocol was to advise employees to retrieve any needed files from the secure company network. He would go looking for a clean version of the Haven files, and he would find my beautiful poisoned gift waiting for him. With the trap set, there was one final step. I had to protect the original. The next morning, I put on a charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn in years. It was the armor of a different life, the one I might have had if I'd ever demanded the credit I deserved. I drove downtown to a high-rise office of glass and steel that scraped the sky. The lawyer was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, the kind of person who radiated an aura of expensive, unshakable competence. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed," she said, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for seeing me," I replied, my voice even. "But I'm here as Tara." I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew the name. "I need to ensure my intellectual property is ironclad," I said, getting straight to the point. The name Tara, and every design associated with it, past, present, and future. I placed a small encrypted hard drive on her polished mahogany desk. It contained every blueprint, every sketch, every note I had ever created. My entire professional life. "This is the asset," I said. "I need it protected from all possible infringement. I want the copyrights registered, the trademarks filed, everything. I want it to be a legal fortress." She looked from the hard drive to my face, a new level of understanding in her gaze. "I understand completely," she said. "We can begin immediately." Walking out of that law office, the bright Texas sun felt different. It wasn't just heat, it was clarity. I felt a profound, unshakable calm. My work was safe. My trap was set. Marcus and his brilliant young shark thought they were the predators, circling their prey. They had no idea they were the ones swimming straight into a perfectly designed, inescapable net. I was no longer the victim in their story. I was the architect of their ending. They had no idea they were the ones swimming straight into a perfectly designed, inescapable net. I was no longer just reacting. I was directing the entire show. All I had to do was wait for my lead actor to take his cue. 2 days later, he did. He walked into my office just after dinner, holding his tablet like a trophy. He was beaming, radiating the smug relief of a man who believes he's just pulled off something clever. He didn't come in to talk. He came in to gloat. He leaned against the corner of my old oak drafting table, a casual invasion of my sacred space, and angled the screen toward me. On it, glowing under the soft lamplight, were my poisoned blueprints. "Took a look at those Haven drafts you put on the network," he said, his tone a perfect blend of casual praise and ownership. "Good, clean. You're finally getting the hang of a streamlined workflow." I was sitting in my chair, a half-empty mug of tea warming my hands. I looked from the flawed designs on his screen to his confident face, and I felt nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. I was an actress in a play studying my scene partner. I smiled faintly. "I'm glad they meet your approval. They're a solid starting point," he continued, magnifying a section with a flick of his fingers. "Now that I have the final master files, I can hand them off to the team. Kendra's been chomping at the bit to run the final cost analysis." He said it so easily. Now that I have the files. As if he'd discovered them, like a prospector finding a nugget of gold, instead of stealing them from the heart of my life's work. He was already passing them on to her, the brilliant young shark, so she could put her stamp on them. He was erasing me from the equation, right in front of my face, and he was proud of it. Then came the line that broke the last rusted chain of affection I had for him. He switched off the tablet, the screen going dark, and looked at me with an expression of magnanimous concern. It was the kind of look a man gives a well-meaning but slightly incompetent employee. "You know, Ev," he said, his voice softening into a symphony of condescension. "You should really take a vacation when this is all done. Go to a spa for a week or something. To be honest, you look tired." Tired. The word landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't saying I looked exhausted from hard work he appreciated. He was saying I looked worn out, old, and fragile. He was dismissing me as a delicate creature who had overexerted herself and now needed to be sent away to rest while the real professionals took over. My gaze dropped from his face to the surface of the drafting table he was leaning on. My eyes found a deep, jagged gouge near the edge, a scar left by a slipped blade years ago. And as I stared at that flaw in the wood, the world dissolved. The office was the same, but the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, 15 years ago. I was 28 years old and 8 months pregnant with a baby who had decided my ribs were a soccer goal. I hadn't slept in 2 days. The massive oak table was littered with crumpled sketches, eraser dust, and an ashtray overflowing with Marcus's nervous cigarettes. My back was a solid wall of fire, and I was hunched over the blueprints for Evergreen Terrace, the project that was supposed to be our big break, the one that was about to bankrupt us. Marcus had made a mistake, a colossal, career-ending zoning error. He'd misread the county setback requirements, and our entire site plan was illegal. We had a presentation to the city council in 5 hours, and our $500,000 investment was about to go up in smoke. He'd found out at dinner the night before. He'd panicked, raged, blamed the surveyors, blamed the city, blamed me for not double-checking his work. Then, around midnight, he'd collapsed. He'd looked at me with the hollow eyes of a beaten man and said, "It's over, Ev. We're ruined." Then he'd gone to bed. But I couldn't. I couldn't let us fail. So I sat at this table, my enormous belly pressed against its edge, and I worked. Fueled by a terrifying surge of adrenaline and a pot of burnt coffee, I tore through the county zoning code, my mind racing, and then, around 3 a.m., I found it. A tiny loophole, a clause about shared green spaces that, if we reoriented the entire plot layout, would not only make us compliant, but would actually increase our density allowance. It was a miracle of design, a solution born of pure desperation. I worked frantically, my hands shaking with fatigue, my pencil flying across the page, redrawing everything. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent reminder of the future I was fighting for. I remember whispering to my belly, "It's okay. Mommy's got this." This, I thought, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, is what marriage is. You carry each other. You sacrifice. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. I was back in my office. 15 years had passed. The baby was in college. Marcus was still leaning against my table, smiling his smug, oblivious smile. The word he had spoken still hung in the air, but now it was radioactive. Tired. I looked at him, at his expensive watch and his perfectly tailored shirt, and I saw him not as my husband, but as a stranger. The man I had sacrificed for was gone. Maybe he had never been there at all. In his place was a thief who had just told the woman who saved him that she looked like she needed a nap. A strange, unnerving calm settled over me. I lifted my head and met his gaze. The actress was gone. The woman looking at him now was the real me. "You're right, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "A vacation sounds like a wonderful idea. Thank you for thinking of me." He beamed, relieved. He thought he had my consent. He thought I was grateful. He was a fool. The sacrifice wasn't what I did for him all those years ago, hunched over this table in the dark. The real sacrifice would be my silence. The real sacrifice would be letting him win. And I was done making sacrifices. The day of the investor showcase was not a sacrifice. It was a reckoning. It was the day the architect would present her final, unalterable design. I chose my armor carefully. A charcoal gray suit, sharp and professional, the kind of suit that doesn't ask for attention, but commands respect. I walked into the conference room at the downtown Four Seasons, a space designed to make people feel small and money feel big. The air was cool and smelled of expensive coffee and corporate ambition. I was an anonymous face in a sea of dark suits and quiet power. I found a seat in the back row, opened my tablet and waited. I saw them all. Leo was near the front, looking pale and nervous, constantly fidgeting with his tie. And then I saw her, Kendra Vance. She was exactly as I'd pictured. Young, sharp, dressed in a power suit that probably cost more than my first car. She radiated a hard, glossy confidence. She stood next to Marcus, laughing at something he said, placing a familiar hand on his arm. I watched them, and the strangest thing happened. I felt nothing. No jealousy, no rage. It was like watching two strangers in a movie. They were simply characters in a story whose ending I had already written. Then the lights dimmed, and Marcus took the stage. He was electric, I had to give him that. He was a master salesman, a storyteller who could sell you a swamp and make you believe it was a luxury resort. He moved across the stage, his voice resonating with passion and vision, painting a picture of the haven, my vision. He used my words, my concepts, my philosophy of design. He spoke of sustainable living and community connection, all while the flawed, poisoned blueprints I had designed for him glowed on the massive screen behind him. He was performing a masterpiece of fraud, and the room was captivated. A project this ambitious, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, requires more than just experience. It requires a new, forward-thinking energy. That's why I've partnered with one of the brightest new minds in strategic development. He gestured to the front row. My visionary new partner, Kendra Vance. Kendra stood and gave a small, confident wave. The investors applauded politely. She and Marcus shared a look, a quick, triumphant glance that was meant to be secret, but I saw it. The look of co-conspirators who believe they've already won. He finished his presentation to a roar of applause. He had them. He had sold them the swamp. I'd be happy to take any questions, he said, basking in the glow of the projector. A few easy questions came from the front. An investor he knew well asked about the timeline. Another asked about the tax incentives. He answered them all with practiced ease, his confidence growing with every word. He was untouchable. He scanned the room, a final triumphant smile on his face. Any other questions? My hand went up. A ripple went through the room. Who was this woman in the back? I saw Leo's head snap in my direction, his eyes wide with panic. Marcus's smile tightened at the edges. He squinted into the dim light. Evelyn? He said, his voice a little too loud. What are you doing here? I stood up, my tablet held loosely in one hand. My voice when I spoke was calm and clear, cutting through the murmuring. Mr. Reed, I said, using his formal name. The shift was a small earthquake, a wonderful presentation. I just have a question about your architect, the one you referred to as Tara. The name landed in the room with a thud. Marcus's face went rigid. What about her? He asked, his voice tight. Her designs are, as you said, the entire foundation of this project, I continued, my eyes not on him, but on the lead investor in the front row, a sharp, older woman known for her brutal due diligence. Could you please tell the investors if you have secured the exclusive, legally binding intellectual property rights from her for this project? I'd imagine that for a 9-figure investment, that paperwork would be fairly important. The room was dead silent. Every investor, every analyst, was now leaning forward, their faces unreadable masks of calculation. They smelled risk. Marcus stood frozen on the stage, a deer in the headlights of a freight train. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately toward Leo, then to Kendra, but they were as frozen as he was. I didn't wait for his answer. Because I am Tara, I said, my voice not rising, not shaking, just stating an undeniable fact. And you don't. A collective gasp went through the room. Before the chaos could erupt, I clicked a button on my tablet. The projector screen behind Marcus flickered. On the left side, his beautiful, flawed blueprint remained. But on the right side, my real, copyrighted master blueprint appeared. I used my tablet's laser pointer to circle a section of his plan. What you have before you, I said, my voice now addressed directly to the investors, is a set of plans with a catastrophic miscalculation in the foundational grading. A mistake that will lead to millions in flood damage and lawsuits. I moved the laser. You also have a residential orientation that is 7 degrees off true south, completely nullifying the passive solar design and turning your eco-friendly community into an energy hog. I clicked again, and the legal registration number for my copyright of the Terra brand and the Haven designs appeared in bold letters at the bottom of my blueprint. What you have, ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice dropping as I delivered the final blow, is a presentation for a project my husband does not have the legal right to build, based on plans that are structurally and financially ruinous. What you have is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. What I have is the real thing. I lowered my tablet. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect vacuum of shock and dawning fury. I watched as the lead investor slowly, deliberately, closed her leather-bound notebook. I saw Kendra Vance, the brilliant young shark, staring at the screen with a look of pure, unadulterated horror as she realized her name was now attached to a spectacular public fraud. And I looked at Marcus, my husband of 20 years, the man who had called me tired. He was pale, trembling, a hollowed-out shell of the titan who had stood on that stage just 2 minutes before. His legacy was in ashes. And the non-contributing spouse, the invisible woman he had erased, was the one holding the match. And the non-contributing spouse, the invisible woman he had erased, was the one holding the match. For a long moment, nobody moved. The air in the room was a perfect vacuum, every molecule of oxygen sucked out by the sheer shock of it all. Marcus stood on the stage, a statue carved from ash, his face a mask of disbelief. My 2 sets of blueprints, the truth and the lie, glowed behind him like a diptych of his damnation. The silence stretched for an eternity, and in that silence I watched 20 years of lies begin to collapse in on themselves. The first sound was not a shout, but a quiet, decisive click. It was the sound of the lead investor, the sharp-eyed woman in the front row, snapping her leather portfolio shut. She stood up, her movements economical and precise. She didn't look at me, she looked directly at Marcus, and her voice, though quiet, sliced through the room like a shard of glass. "My firm, Mr. Reed," she said, her tone devoid of all emotion, "does not invest in charlatans, and we certainly do not invest in thieves." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "We're out." That was the signal. That was the first swing of the wrecking ball. A murmur erupted in the room, a low, angry buzz. Then came a series of sounds, a cascade of finality. More clicks from portfolios snapping shut. The scrape of a dozen chairs as the other investors stood as one. No one yelled. No one made a scene. They were predators who had sniffed out a fatal weakness, and their reaction was not anger, but a swift and ruthless retreat. They turned their backs on Marcus, pulling out their phones, their thumbs already flying across the screens, spreading the news, killing his reputation before he had even stepped off the stage. The deal wasn't just dead, it was being buried. From my vantage point in the back, I watched the secondary explosions. I saw Leo, his face the color of wet cement, trying to slip out through the crowd. He almost made it to the door. But a man I recognized, a senior partner at a major local construction firm, a man Leo and Marcus had played golf with for years, stepped directly into his path. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Don't even think about calling me Leo," the man said, his voice a low growl. "You, your brother, you're poison. We're done." He stepped aside, and Leo practically scrambled out of the room like the rat he was, his career ending not with a bang, but with a quiet, humiliating dismissal in a hotel hallway. Then my eyes found Kendra, the brilliant young shark. She wasn't panicking, she wasn't crying, she was already gone. While all eyes were on Marcus and the investors, she had been methodically gathering her purse and her notes. I watched her slip out a side exit, her movements fluid and silent. She was a survivor. She knew a sinking ship when she saw one, and she had no intention of going down with the captain. She was cutting her losses, disappearing back into the world to find another host, leaving the wreckage behind without a second glance. She was exactly what Marcus deserved. I remained seated, an island of calm in the chaos I had unleashed. I didn't feel triumph, not in the way I'd expected. I didn't feel a rush of vengeful glee. I felt a quiet, profound sense of order being restored. It was the feeling an architect gets when a flawed, unstable structure is finally demolished, clearing the way for something true and strong to be built in its place. This wasn't a messy, emotional outburst. It was a controlled demolition. Every wire had been placed, every charge had been calculated. I was simply watching the laws of physics do their work. Within 5 minutes, the room was almost empty. The investors were gone. The partners were gone. The sharks were gone. The waiters had even started to discreetly clear away the half-empty coffee cups. All that remained was the wreckage, and in the center of it all stood Marcus. He hadn't moved. He was still on the stage, a solitary figure trapped in the bright, unforgiving glow of the projector. My 2 blueprints, the monument to his fraud, were still displayed behind him. He looked small under the vastness of the screen, a man dwarfed by the scale of his own lies. He stared out at the empty chairs, his shoulders slumped, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The charismatic salesman, the visionary developer, the titan of industry, they had all evaporated. All that was left was a man who had been caught. I stood up. My chair made a soft scraping sound in the cavernous silence. His head lifted and his eyes found mine across the empty room. There was nothing in them. No anger, no hatred. Just a vast, hollow emptiness. He had built his entire world on my foundation, and I had just quietly, methodically, pulled it out from under him. There was nothing left to say, there was nothing left to do. I turned my back on him and walked out of the conference room. I didn't look back. I left him there alone on his stage, a king with no kingdom, a developer with nothing left to build, illuminated by the harsh, inescapable light of the truth. The demolition was complete. The site was finally clear. The demolition was complete. The site was finally clear. I didn't stay to watch the cleanup crew. I walked out of that hotel, got into my car, and drove not home, but toward the open highway, the city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror until they were just a dull, forgotten glow. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in 20 years, I was the one holding the map. I was gone for 2 weeks. I drove through the sparse, beautiful plains of West Texas, stayed in anonymous motels, and drank coffee in small-town diners. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't check my email. I just let the silence and the space wash over me, clearing out the dust and debris of a life that was no longer mine. While the scandal I had unleashed was tearing through the Houston business community like a wildfire, I was watching the sunrise over a canyon, feeling the first clean, uncomplicated peace I had felt in years. When I returned, it was not as a wife coming home, but as a contractor overseeing a final extraction. I hired a moving company. The men were efficient and impersonal. They packed my clothes, my books, my personal effects, and then, with the care of museum curators, they disassembled my old oak drafting table, wrapping each piece in soft, thick blankets. It was the only piece of furniture I took. The rest, the sterile leather couches, the glass tables, the king-sized bed, the smart home tablet still glowing foolishly on the kitchen wall, was just part of a stage set for a play that had closed. I left the keys on the empty counter and walked out the front door without looking back. I wasn't there when Marcus finally came to pack up the remnants of his life, but I know how it went. My lawyer had relayed the conversation. Leo, his reputation in tatters, had been there to help. The house must have felt like a tomb. I imagine them walking through the echoing, empty rooms, their footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floors. Sunlight would have been streaming through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air where our life used to be. The ghosts of furniture would have been visible on the rugs, pale outlines of a shared history. All that was left were the things that were undeniably his, the glass and chrome desk, the soulless chairs, the gallery of ego on his study walls. They worked in a grim, resentful silence for hours, taping up cheap cardboard boxes with the things a person accumulates when they aren't paying attention. Old golf trophies, expensive suits he would now have no occasion to wear, untouched crystal decanters from the bar. It was the sad archaeology of a fallen king. Finally, Leo couldn't take the silence anymore. He was a man who had lost everything by proxy. His own clients had abandoned him. His professional circle had shunned him. He was radioactive by association. He had followed his big brother off a cliff, and now he was standing at the bottom, looking at the wreckage. I can picture him, standing in the middle of my empty office, the place where the magic used to happen. He would have looked around at the blank walls and the empty floor, a space that now felt hollowed out, like a chest with the heart removed. "I don't get it, Marcus," he would have said, his voice flat, defeated. I don't get it. I thought you had it all handled. I thought the lawyers had a plan. Marcus, probably taping up a box of his ridiculously expensive shoes, wouldn't have looked at him. The plan was flawed. The plan was flawed? Leo's voice would have risen, a bitter, hysterical edge creeping in. The plan was built on you telling me she was nothing. A nobody. You told me she wouldn't fight. You told me she didn't even know what was going on. You told me she was just a gardener, tending to the pretty parts while we did the real work. There it was, the lie that had underpinned their entire scheme, the dismissal that had been their fatal error, the belief that my work was merely decorative, an optional extra, while theirs was foundational. Marcus would have stopped taping. He would have straightened up slowly, his back aching from the unfamiliar labor. He would have looked at the empty space in the center of the room, the clean square of flooring where my drafting table had stood for 2 decades. The empty space where the engine of his entire career used to be. He would have finally understood that the room wasn't just empty, it was powerless. He finally turned to his brother, and for the first time there was no bluster, no arrogance, no sales pitch, just the quiet, devastating weight of the truth. She wasn't the gardener, Leo, he said, his voice a hollow whisper that barely carried across the empty room. She was the architect. He paused, the admission hanging in the dusty air between them. Of all of it, he said, I was the architect of all of it. A final, whispered admission in an empty room. I'm sure in his mind it was some great tragic revelation. But the truth is, I didn't need to hear him say it. I already knew. I had stopped waiting for his permission to exist, for his validation of my work. I was too busy building. 6 months later, the Texas sun is high and hot, beating down on the rich, dark earth of a construction site. The air is alive with the sounds of creation, the whine of circular saws, the rhythmic punch of nail guns, the rumble of a diesel engine. It smells of fresh-cut pine, turned soil, and possibility. This is my new office, my real office. I'm standing on a ridge overlooking the controlled chaos, a hard hat on my head and steel-toed boots covered in a satisfying layer of dust. This is the haven. My haven, and it is rising from the ground, real and true. A black SUV pulls up, and a woman in a tailored suit, the same sharp-eyed investor from the presentation, gets out. Ann Vance is my new partner. After the demolition at the hotel, she had found my lawyer. She hadn't offered sympathy, she'd offered a deal. She had the capital, and I had the vision, the real vision. It was the easiest handshake of my life. The West Sector is 3 days ahead of schedule, Tara, she says, joining me on the ridge. She's the only one who calls me that. To the world, I'm Evelyn Reed, the head of my own design firm. But to her, I am the artist she invested in. The solar orientation on those lots is perfect. The foreman said he's never seen a more precise site plan. I smile, a real smile. The kind that starts in your chest and works its way up. That's what happens when you build on a solid foundation, Anne. We both know I'm not just talking about concrete. We walk down to the on-site command center, a large, air-conditioned trailer buzzing with energy. It's a chaotic mess of charts, schedules, and coffee cups. And in the very center of it all, commanding the room, is my old oak drafting table. It's not hidden away in a silent, lonely office anymore. It's here, in the heart of the action, its scarred surface covered in blueprints that now bear a simple, bold logo in the corner. Tara. It's not a secret, it's a brand, it's my name. I think back to my old life, to the quiet, invisible woman moving through those silent, perfect rooms. I had mistaken that suffocating quiet for peace. I had mistaken my invisibility for safety. I thought my role was to be the gardener, tending to the beautiful, fragile things while the real work happened elsewhere. But a garden without a plan is just a patch of weeds. A house without a blueprint is just a pile of lumber. The architect doesn't just make things pretty. The architect is the one who imagines the entire world and then draws the map that allows everyone else to build it. Marcus had tried to steal my map. He thought the drawings were the treasure, but he never understood that the treasure wasn't the lines on the page, it was the mind that drew the lines. It was the vision. And that was something he could never own. I heard he and Leo tried to start over, but their reputations were mud. No one would fund them. No one would work with them. Last I heard, Marcus was selling high-end real estate in a different state, using his charm to sell houses designed by other, better architects. He's a salesman, That's all he ever really was. I stand here, on my own patch of earth, and I feel a profound sense of rightness. This is what I was meant to do, not in the shadows but out here, in the Sunday, building things that are honest and strong and true. I am not a non-contributing spouse. I am the founder. I am the creator. I am the architect. And this is my legacy. He had spent 20 years trying to keep my name in the shadows, to own my work as his own, but in the end I learned that a name isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you build for yourself, one true line at a time. So let me ask you, if life handed you a raw, empty piece of land, a chance to start from scratch, what would you have the courage to build? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding the strength to draw your own blueprints.